Welcome to the second season of the Design Sub-Series.
She's great.
So I'll begin tonight by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Bieber Nation, traditional custodians of the land on which we gather tonight, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here tonight. So at Turner, we highly encourage that design is for everyone. So no matter what projects or phase of the project that you're working on, we believe that design should be the forefront of daily conversation. Our Design Talk series focuses on people and place at the heart of design, and tonight's topic is on retail place experience. So before I introduce this evening's speaker, I just would like to share a brief intro on retail. So the retail sectors has been a key component in the economic growth for the city of Sydney, comprising of more than 78 businesses. Retail does play an important role in activations and also livability of the city. The city of Sydney believes that retail is the source of the Main Street activation and acts as a attractor. As you can see over the last decade, City of Sydney has been undergoing a major retail upgrade and transformation. And just to name a few, Westfield City completed in 2010, Central Hub 2013, Bellringer 2016, Gateway Sydney University in 2018, and Darling Square in 2019. So within this time frame, Bieber has contributed to the development of several major retail centers across Sydney metropolitan area. And as we all know, East Village was completed in 2014, West Village 2018, Bay Central is currently undergoing construction, and many mixed-use projects that are at an early stage of design. So what makes a good retail? Right. So I believe as designers, there are three main elements that we need to consider in creating a great retail place. The first thing is the culture. We need to understand the people, and we need to understand who are our audience. We need to understand what are the demographics, and we need to understand the context lifestyle, whether it is actually in the middle of the urban context, or whether it's actually in a setting which is closer to the beach, or in a regional center that has a rich history of a particular precinct. We also need to understand how people get around. Like, for example, security in Melbourne, whether you actually need to cater for a massive parking infrastructure to actually support the livability of the retail space, or whether it's to actually create a series of connected laneways to gather people from one side of the city to the major retail buildings. We also need to understand the targeted time of activation, and we could look at whether it is the same people that we be inhabiting the same space during the daytime and the nighttime. The reason why culture is very important is because it's the driver that will create and define the retail space itself. It will create and define identity of the retail space. The second thing is the climate. So in Sydney, we're quite fortunate that we don't actually have high temperature summer or very cold winter days. 80% of the time is quite particular outside. So as we can draw upon some of the successful retail examples in the city that is kind of quite massive, open, and extremely constructive, it is to do with going away with the idea of sticking with the big box retail supermall or shopping centers and moving away from that typologies. The third thing and the last thing is to understand the density. So it is important to design and cater for space that will be infilled with an appropriate distribution of people, and we need to understand our population. Just to give an example, we're not a city like Tokyo or any other only dense populated city when we need to start relying on the second layers or third layers of activation to actually take the pressure of the ground floor. But on the other hand, we need to actually start infilling and creating our ground floor to make sure that we're actually providing enough space and also enough activations that are going to happen during the daytime and nighttime. Because the worst thing that can happen is when you design such a beautiful space and have no one actually fulfilling it. So those are the three things that I want to display with us tonight. And tonight we are very fortunate to be joined by one of Sydney's best real advisors, Sam Shepherd, who is the founder of Bellringer Property Group. So just to read a short bio on Sam, having traveled extensively and lived in both inner city and regional locations, Sam noticed an evolution in the places that were resonating with the community and delivering improved economic and social outcomes. He founded Bellringer in response to the growing demand for property projects that better resonated with target customers, the importance of retail, and non-traditional commercial elements as key driver and anchor to place experience of property projects. Some notable projects include Winter Place, that is Hoppers Market, South Hill Shopping Village, 60 Marketplace, 55 Market Street, and many more. So with Turners, Sam has collaborated in the project of building the Town Center and also Blackwood Hills, which was known as the Yard, that is currently being nominated for national awards for the BIA for excellence in hospitality. So please join me in welcoming Sam Shepherd.
Thank you for having me, everyone. Thank you for the introduction and the background. Just by way of my background, I was in the property industry for about 20 years, 25 years. Started off doing residential golf courses with a company called City Property Group, and then started in retail with GPT, doing multi-goods centres, shopping centres. I refer to this at times think that were shopping centres, but what was really interesting and how much I learned there was at the time they were doing Rouse Hill Town Centre, which was a big evolution of what the shopping centre model was, but also the importance in retail in how do you attract people, because it's one property class that's highly measurable. Typically, the retail sales are measured, so the retailers have to tell the landlord each month how much they've what their turnover has been, and you're measuring foot traffic. And typically, it's a develop and hold approach where residential and many other categories, it's develop and sell. And sure, you can sort of measure the rent, but as far as visitation, whether it's resonating with people, that's where retail I've learned a hell of a lot about. You're trying to create these environments that attract people. As much as the term placemaking gets used a hell of a lot these days, I was very fortunate early in my career to work with a company called Village Well, who I would say are the original pioneers of placemaking Australia. They had very good relationships with project public spaces. And I learned an incredible amount from Bieber, really trying to understand that different approach to really understanding how projects come together. But I'll sort of give you a little bit of background, some more detailed background about myself. I had certain principles when I started going in property group that very much how do you really engage with who your target user is. And in those times, going back 10 years ago or so, a lot of the other property classes didn't think about that. In that time, there's been a huge evolution. But really, what I tend to do and bring to the property projects is providing a disciplined and commercial, but yet innovative and creative approach to adding value to property projects. I'll explain later on how that happens. There's some great projects overseas that talks to that process. A lot of what I talk about here is delivering projects that enhance the livability experience and the well-being of those communities that you're in. If you don't resonate with those communities that live in something, they're not going to visit. If they don't visit, your asset's going to fail. So when they start to visit, that creates value capture opportunities, and when there's value capture opportunities, that creates asset value improvement. And I often talk about good retail has to work socially, because if it doesn't work socially, then no one's coming there, and so as a result, the project will fail. Here are some of my principles here, and I won't go into too much detail. I've spoken a lot about them just then, but I think some of the key ones is need to consider all users and their interests and aspirations and their lifestyle, as James spoke to. Engagement's really important, particularly what's happened over the past 20 years is how multicultural Australia's become, and arguably many of the Western countries. And the old approach of I know build and they will come just doesn't work. The projects where you had a whole bunch of white middle-aged, Anglo middle-class guys in the middle of the city trying to develop a project in Western Suburbs, and they had no idea what those communities' needs, wants, aspirations were. So the importance of doing that engagement to really understand what they're after, and it's, they might call it community engagement, but I think user engagement is really important for de-risking a project, because then you've got a greater chance of delivering something that's going to resonate with your target users. But really important to this outcome, I think, is really this collaborative approach, trying to bring in a whole bunch of leading consultants in this field to get to the right outcome. My view is in the old model of the development manager sitting at the top, talking down to the project manager, who talks down to the architect, who talks down to the landscape architect and all the other consultants. That hierarchical approach doesn't lead to best outcomes. My view is the development manager sits in the middle, or the client sits in the middle, and then all the various consultants sit around that. So it's more a circular process where there's all this cross interaction going on. And I think the other thing that's really important is making sure there aren't egos, or leave other words I would use, expressions I was in the pub, because that leads to a breakdown in communication. And when there's a breakdown in communication, people aren't going to speak up. You're not going to understand where there are issues going on, and that's a sure way for a project to not reach its full potential. Skills and services, I spoke about development management advisory, but it's probably more development advisory than traditional development management now. Retail projects is a big part of what I do. Not all of what I do. I think the definition of retail has changed a lot. Retail, which used to be in shopping centres, and shops, where these days I think you talk about childcare, medical centres, you talk about the public space and how it interfaces with it, libraries. There's a whole bunch of uses that I think that come under the term retail these days. Collaborations I spoke about. Urban renewal, how do you reposition particular assets to change or evolve with changing demographics. Place curation, I think everyone says they're involved in placement or place curation these days, but I think it's just a development process. And then sustainable development, both from a triple bottom line approach, which is how does it work socially. Sector experience, I spoke to a lot of that there, I won't go into that. The only that probably it's worth noting is I've worked on a number of retail streets and external retail, not shopping centres. So that mixed use experience of external retail, and that's a very different approach to traditional shopping centres, because how do you interface with that external space? Because it's really important, because that really drives performance of the retail. So one example I use is, for example, the tree species that might be selected. Space is tight. You can't have a hell of a lot of tree trunks if you want to create this great microclimate. Humans prefer 22 to 28 degrees. That's the desired temperature. When that temperature's there, you're going to drive visitation. You're going to drive dwell time. If you're space constraints, sometimes the best solution will be an exotic tree rather than a native. And I know that sort of goes against a lot of the current thinking in a particular project, but I think it's really important to think about that, because if a place isn't human friendly, people aren't going to visit and it's going to fail. So you've got to think of all those different layers there. Place story, really important, but you also got to think is it human friendly. One thing I use a lot is how the build form needs to facilitate the delivery of the soft elements, which will define the experience. And soft can be events, can be the retail mix, all those things which essentially isn't the build form. And I guess that goes back to that principle of function over form. Form's really important, but there's no point having some great looking building if people aren't coming there. It doesn't work. So it's how do the two of them work together, and the importance of collaboration in that. I spoke about the don't build and they will come, but build it right and they will come back. I think that's really, really important in retail. Retail is detail. It's a corny expression, but it gets used a lot. But as you can see, I'm not going to go through them, but they're the types of things that come together for a successful retail project. And no one person is going to be across all of that. You need to seek input from leasing, project management, design team, operating teams. There's all sorts of people that need to provide inputs into this project. And I think what's happened of late with particularly mixed-use projects, it's difficult at times to pull all that experience into a project. That's where I've been fortunate, having worked in retail management or shopping centre management and development management. It sort of helps that I've got a bit of a skill set where I say to a jack of all trades, master of none when it comes to retail. Because if he's really trying to take that next step, there's all sorts of consultants you need to bring on board that you can't necessarily afford. Dan Bieber's a guy that I often refer to. Dan Bieber's a guy that was engaged by the Rockefellers to revitalise Bryant Park. Bryant Park was a park guarantee funding if you crossed it. So he was brought on to revitalise that park. He secured a peppercorn lease or a $1 a year lease with the local government, the local authority, and he then basically turned his park into one of the, arguably the most successful park in the world. And he's really big on it. It's all about programs. That drive the design and turn around. It's something it's not spending lots of money on fancy architects. It's about landscape architects here. There are too many cases where lots of money's been paid to make a great space. It opens and no one comes. Programming is what makes people come. I think there's more to it than just the programming or events, but I think it's a really valid point that understanding what's going to make a retail central space work. This is the approach that I tend to take. It's a bit of a discipline process. I said before about the importance of having disciplines to get to this outcome as opposed to the wet finger in the air. And I think creating a brief is really important on that. I really don't envy poor architects at times when they have a client come in and say, we've got this parcel plan, just design something for us. They give you a one-page brief. Like, I just don't know how clients can put this $30 million to $100 million and it comes down to a one-page brief. I find it just mind-boggling. So in this scenario, I think, as Shane spoke to before, really understanding who the about the target customer and understanding their needs, wants, and aspirations. That's really, really important. What are their lifestyles? And part of that comes into these days is psychographics, not demographics. There's a whole bunch of people that are all earning $100,000 a year, but they have different appetites. Some might like going to the pub and sucking back 10,000 years on a weekend. Other guys are far more into going to have a surf. Others are far more into going to the gym. Others are going to the arts. So understanding how those different people enjoy their lifestyle helps to really inform what a project is and what that strategy will be. Global trends, you don't necessarily just want to rely on what people are telling you. You've also got to lead them to some degree, so understanding what's happening globally. Economic research is one that a lot of my clients at times they have no idea about it. Understanding supportable floor area. There's only so many retail dollars to be spent, so if there's too much floor area, you're going to end up with vacancy or crappy retailers in there, or different uses, which then they frost up the windows and they do all sorts of things where it doesn't lead to a great outcome. The planning framework, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. It was interesting today. I was talking to someone in the city of Sydney that has now got these 8 metre setbacks to the towers, and you guys will know this far more than I will. And I'm really big on compression for successful bases, and 8 metre setbacks is going to be a 4 metre wide full park makes it 12 metres. There's a lot of space you need to fill there to make that feel alive and vibrant. The local history and the cultural attributes. What are the stories that can really sort of learn from both from Indigenous and from European? What are some of the things that can be celebrated? I mean, there's a project working on in Melbourne at the moment, the Fitzroy Gas Works, and it's got a great history there. It's got lots of old bricks. How do you bring some of that narrative into the project? On Blackwood Village that I was working with you guys on, we were very much about how do we create something that's going to feel it's part of the community. So the use of timbers and bricks that have this more sort of rural narrative to it, but within an urban framework. And then experience and land use gaps, really sort of understanding what the community find they're missing. One thing, for example, in the western suburbs, who have worked on a number of projects there, and they say they want to have those inner city urban experiences. They don't have them down there. They don't have independent retailers. But what they do want, they want it to be run by their mates or their locals as opposed to what they regard as some of the inner city units. It's really understanding and delivering something that's going to resonate both physically and culturally. Here's another process to go through, which is make sure you're going through appropriate gates before you jump too far ahead. So understanding what that opportunity is. So a lot of the front-end research, which is so important. Then preparing that business case or unique proposition. What's going to make you different to the other projects that are near you or competition. That's really, really important. You don't want to replicate something that's down the road and then you don't have a point of difference. Then that then starts to inform the your preliminary design. I can give a retail mix. Here are the type of uses that we want. So the architects go, okay, we need a 5,000 square metre supermarket. We need a 1,200 square metre medical centre. We want to put in a whole micro tenancies to attract independent retailers. So we need things that might be somewhere from 15 to 30 square metres. So making sure all those elements come together, and then just you're moving on from there. So there's a lot of retail colonnades are a disaster in Australia. They just don't work. There's a range of reasons that I won't go into. It's on my Instagram account. I posted one a couple of weeks ago. Then you get to that finalising of the DA, and then you get to the delivery construction. But as you get through into those processes, you're reducing your risk and increasing the chance of success on the project. Here's an interesting project. It's called Blackwood Village in Atlanta, and this is at Christmas time. It looks awesome, doesn't it? You know, you look at all the finishes, you look at the level of diversity that's in there and the eclectic experience of different pot plants. They've done a great job there, but they didn't have a unique proposition. It's basically replicated something that was down the road, and this has been an unmitigated disaster. You know, and that's this classic case. They've got a great looking design, but it didn't have some of those principles in place, foundation principles to make it work. It's quite amazing the amount of money that's spent on this. It's been a disaster. In contrast, something that's called the Grove in LA. At the time, Caruso affiliates, when they developed this, they were told they were mad for doing an external shopping centre, something called an external shopping centre in LA. And they said people in LA only want to go to shopping centres, internal malls. He pushed ahead. He did a whole bunch of engagement to understand what the gaps were. The feedback kept on coming back to we want something for the community. We want something that's like a high street. Being in LA, he took a view that he wanted this to have a lot of theatre. He actually took a lot of cues from Hollywood. A lot of architects go here and they say it just feels way too big now. See, it just feels like Disneyland. You go there and absolutely it feels like that, but it really resonates with the community. I think the other thing that they benefit from is they purchased the land from the LA farmers markets, and they had this big parcel of land and they tried to find a development partner to develop their site. All the other guys came through the shopping malls. Caruso came and said we want to do an external based shopping centre. What that's done is you've got all these small independent retailers, which provides a really good contrast to what is in the Grove, which has got all your big international chains. What this has all led to is basically it's only 55,000 square metres of retail floor space, which is pretty small. Roushill Town Centre is 75, so it gives you a sense of what they've got there. They get more visitors each year than Disneyland or the Great Wall of China. It's the second highest performing shopping centre in the US, the seventh highest performing one in the world. It just goes to show the importance of creating an environment that people want to visit, and that creates the value capture opportunities. The Grace Building in Bright Park, I spoke a little about Bright Park and how he transformed. So that was basically in the 80s. It was terrible. He transformed it into this. It has a huge amount of programming or events that go on. It's got all sorts of different cafes in there. On any given day, there's 45 things you can do. You've got kids book readings, book launches, the table tennis, and then through to things that happen in New York Fashion Week. They take the big green, run a big event there. In the winter, they have an ice rink. The other thing that I talk to a lot of my clients on is the importance of flexible seating. So you think about a cafe will have fixed seating, they're not going to perform very well because they can't change their tables around to suit the groups that are coming through. It's no different from public space. If you want to attract people there, people have got to go there. They can get about 10 people together there, or they can sit at one seat. And William White, who's a famous, I guess, sort of urban observer, he was the editor of Forbes magazine, but he sort of did a lot of great studies on things in New York. And Paley Park was one thing, it's just how important the movable seating was. People would sit down and they just move the seat slightly, and it attracts people day in, day out. Where the fixed seating is, So you got a table that's got 6 seats around, it's all fixed. One person dominates that whole table, so how do people sit down? So it reduces that ability to attract people to public space. What this basically meant is I spoke to a lot of these elements here that are revitalised in the early 1990s. It is a privately managed park, so although it's publicly owned, it's privately managed. And it led to a much improved park, as you can see. Just because something's private doesn't mean it's that. And they focus on events and maintenance rather than landscape design. And they also have what's regarded as the second best public toilets, not public toilets, toilets in New York. So it's up there with a lot of the top hotels. They put flowers in there each day because their view is you need to attract females and kids. And if you do that, everyone else follows. Well, they feel safe, they need to feel safe, and that's that might be a bit incorrect how I describe it. So basically, the Brookfield that owned the Grace Building, and they've reported information that led to an increase in effective rents of $15 per square foot within 5 years. They've got 1.3 million in lettable square feet. Basically, what that meant was an increase in net rent by about $20 million, and on the cap rate at the time delivered almost $400 million in additional value. It wasn't income generating at the time, but it was value enhancing. In 5 years, they had an asset that was worth $400 million more, and they tipped in about $1 million, $2 million into the revitalisation of that. So that just sort of highlights the importance of creating environments that people want to be in, whether it's shopping centres, commercial assets, whatever it's there. Some of the projects I've worked on, I think talking is ANU, so that's my old university. It's Cambrian, which was a revitalisation at the heart of the university. It hadn't changed in the 70s up until 2018. It was really quite poor. The quality of the retail was diabolical, like most universities for that matter. But we went through a process, as I spoke before, how do you engage with the students to understand what they're missing, what they would like, doing the economic research, a whole bunch of things, understanding the gaps, understanding the different connectivity. So as a student, if you want to go enroll for your student card and then get your car parking permit on the campus in a week, you had to walk 1.2 kilometres between those two offices. So how do you start to centralise all of that? As far as the research goes, we took in excess of 10,000 pieces of individual research to guide us on that. So that required a whole master plan and retail, what I refer to as experience master planning. We spoke about the user group engagement, the strategy, and then we were very, very, because of the master plan, very big on going to the urban design first. It set out the look and feel that was sort of going to have sort of a framework that the architects needed to respond to. We found that to be a far better outcome. And then engaged in place managers on that, so guys who were curating the various events with us out there to attract people. The yards at Blackwood Hills, I've spoken about that on what we did there. So I was involved in the very early front-end development management advisory and strategic development, and then there was the ongoing design management feasibility. The Children's Hospital at Westmead, this is sort of still underway at the moment. We'll probably start works on the external public space in the next 12 months. And this was really about how do we transform what hospitals are typically seen as. So the strategy I came up with, how do we create this village terrain where you're going to have pop-ups and you're going to have markets there, it's surrounded by retail. It gives this sense of escape for the community. So you've got patients, sick kids that are there. Sometimes they can get out of the hospital bed, sometimes they can't, but their parents are there for days on end, 24 hours a day. They need access to better retail. The staff there, they're just run ragged. They don't have that sense of that ability to escape. So a lot of feedback was they want to get out of the hospital. Some feedback or some research has been done in the US. The stress for doctors in the US is costing each doctor $7,000 a year to the public health system. So, and a lot of that comes about because they don't have that sense of connection or community. So that was one way that I really reiterate on there, these doctors, all staff to get out of their hospital, that then we have clinical chairs, we have retail, so there's better interaction, better community building, resilient community, and that starts to help reduce some of those costs from staff turnover, etc. that you have in a hospital. 125 Miller Street, North Sydney. There's a lot of debate going on about this asset at the moment. So it's the old MLC Tower in North Sydney. All sorts of challenges with that building. But put aside the heritage elements of that. What we worked on there, we did a whole bunch of economic research, and I did an unofficial online survey and hit up a bunch of guys I knew in North Sydney. As I said, you need to get this out to your to the staff and ask them to pass on. So I got a sense of what the missing experiences were. And then that sort of, I guess, started to inform what our experience master plan was. They wanted urban experiences. Many of you guys see, it's pretty dull and boring. Its last heyday was when I was at school in the early 90s, but Thursday night it was huge. But that hasn't happened for 25 years. Then creating design briefs. Yeah, it's really, really important to get into that detail, understanding width of footpaths, understanding what the width of footpaths is needed for food and beverage. What are the floor to ceiling heights? What's the? Do you want a whole bunch of glass? I'm really big against glass detection. So how do you break down those shop fronts and make them more interesting? And then doing the feasibility that sits around it. So that's, I guess, sort of a bit of a snapshot of I guess, the process of retail projects. I mean, there's so much I could go into sort of retail trends at the moment, etc. But 5 questions at me, and I'll do my best to answer.
It seems like the successful projects are the ones that are unique.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at what point do you go from, there's lots of retail typically culture, they do the Woolworths and the standards, utility kind of weekly shop stuff, and they've got the big shed and they've got the stuff car park around it, and they can just keep on doing it again and again and again. At what point does it trigger to walk into a unique question, and how do you convince someone to have a unique question for a properly funded?
It's, I guess it's very similar to Glen Village. It's the neighbourhood shopping centres, which has Coles and Woolworths in them, and then sort of 15 specialty. And they deliver acceptable returns. But a lot of the time, those assets have been built to supermarkets, so how do they maximise their sales? Where the value of an asset, of a neighbourhood shopping centre asset is in the specialties. So specialties aren't doing well, you can't get the rental increases, which then enhances the value of the asset. But these guys, Coles and Woolworths at the moment, are trying to they'll cannibalise themselves to keep one of the other guys out. So as a result, you start to have a lot of similar assets that have got no point of difference. It doesn't matter if you're in Perth, Sydney, whatever, in these suburban growth areas, these centres feel all the same. So as a result, if you want to compete with that, with a smaller asset where you can't get, say, a big supermarket in there, then you need to deliver a point of difference. And by delivering a point of difference, then you're going to drive increased visitation, which means there's going to be more expenditure, capital opportunities, so that's going to drive the value of your asset. But to do that point of difference, you need to do that research and go through that discipline process to really understand what's going to resonate with that community, so they have a sense of ownership of it and they'll visit. Most of these guys don't have a sense of ownership of it. They call them all sorts of different names. They call them town centres and villages. They're just a shopping centre. So that I think gets to that point of really getting that point of difference, which is going to become more and more important if you want to outperform the market.
What about the balance between having a livable area? We're always trying to increase access to shopping centres.
Yeah.
Yep. What's the balance between putting as much as possible versus putting more?
There are some typical benchmarks that majors to specialties is you need about 70% major and 30% specialty, particularly in the neighbourhood in the suburban area. So your supermarket will take up 70% of the floor space, and then your specialty takes up 30%. But you might have a medical centre, but they're indicatively the margin you need to think about. As far as doing how much to get in there, that's where you need the economic research to understand how much floor space is supportable. Otherwise, you just got to wet finger the air, and it's going to be a recipe for disaster. And that highlights the importance of the supportable retail floor area. But you still might back yourself, we can do this a little bit differently, so we think we can support a large amount of floor area. And the guys at Location IQ, I've got a really good relationship with. They'll do, if you do the box standard development, this is how much you can support. If you're going to do something different, we feel you will attract more people, you get more expenditure, so you can support a larger amount of floor area. Big is not always better. It's no. You should think about if you've got a big, what we call a super regional shopping centre, like a Bondi Junction or Bellringer Mall, if someone goes and builds a shopping centre right next to them, what's the chance of their success? It may work, but it's really trying to understand what the mix and the available expenditure is in that market. And it's sort of why I have major issues with council saying when they're ground floor activation, it's all got to be retail. Well, if there's so much retail floor space, it's going to end up vacant, or you have, dodgy massage parlours or really poor looking food and beverage. Yeah, that's not a great outcome for that community. Purely because council says we've got to have retail, and retail's the only form of activation.
Going there, I find it like yes, but it was very successful. It's not a placemaking, right? So the brand coming in,
Yeah.
this kind of each street or even looks like
That's right. If I go back to the tradition that worked very well, this process. There we go.
So here are all the inputs that are so critical. That then comes up with a strategy. So this is for a retail asset. Then you've got your design, your look and feel, which is really, really important. Internal, external, whatever it might be. Then the range of uses. So what's the retail mix you're going to have there? But not just retail. What are the other trip generators? So it might be libraries, an awesome kids' playground, school, any of those uses that's going to drive people to visit the place. Events and activations, those soft elements. So you've got to make sure the design can accommodate those events and activations. And the more flexible the space is, it gives it a greater opportunity to hold more users. It makes it more resilient and evolve into the future. The ongoing engagement, you really want to make sure you're doing events and engaging with that community so they continue to have that sense of ownership. And then operations, making sure the centre's being managed well. And in the past, I guess it's called property management. I think what it needs to be called now by the better guys are for the place management. So they're still collecting the rent off the guys and turning the lights on and off and maintaining it, but they then now need to curate events. So they need to become a really good, sexy event manager, or putting up great seasonal installations, whether it might be Chinese New Year, Easter, whatever it might be. So all those things coming together is what's going to make a successful retail asset. And a lot of people will call that placemaking. And yeah, it is, but I think what that highlights is that's just good development process. It's just in recent times, there's been a word that's been used in Australian market that's been around for 30 years, but there's been a lot more people that start to focus on it. But I think what's important in that, it's a human-centric approach, and you need to engage people to understand it. There's one architect on the project that was out, and they put in a little, it's got a little park, it's about this size, and they go, "There's our placemaking." This is just wrong. Like it's a far more sophisticated, holistic view to creating something that's going to attract people.
One of the questions I have is, for example, challenges this example of
Yeah.
It's open up like a basic detail.
Yeah.
But it's actually relying more on features, but it's especially detail. And then if you look at there are kind of special details,
Yeah.
It's always there. So I think what is the driver to actually make it work, rather than just
and that comes down to understanding what's there. It's the US post the GFC. There were a lot of US malls failed, and just ghost malls. And the reason for that is most of the malls in the US are discretionary spend, fashion. In Australia, we have a lot of what's called non-discretionary spend, so supermarkets, pharmacies, whatever you want to call it, things that you are always going to need. That really helped our centres survive. But as you say, Central Park, Spice Alley goes really well. You go to the retail, and it was designed by a Singaporean architect that doesn't get retail in Australia. So they designed 3 levels of retail. Typically, retail above ground plane in Australia doesn't work unless it's highly destinational. When you start moving up, the rents start to decline significantly. So in Queen Victoria building, the rents they get on the 3rd level is about 15%, 20% of what they get at the ground level. You need to rely on passing traffic. So back to that mix. I think that's what's really important now is people will go to a major destination, be it like Westfield, Sydney, or even Bondi Junction to do their fashion spend. When you start to look at other assets, it's really about how you get that experience economy element to it, and then non-discretionary. You've really got to understand that mix of uses because goes in. So there's a leasing guide I use, and he's from a Asian Australian background, that he gets different. It's like mainland Chinese, Hong Kong Chinese, Thai. It's not just let's get an Asian mix in. He really understands that different demographics and different cultural groups and how they differ to tailor that use of that retail mix. But Spice Alley is really interesting because Stanley basically owns all the operators there. He wasn't able to find all these individual small operators. It can get really hard. The US has got this awesome, huge food truck market. So finding small operators to bring them into the US is this thing called food court, which it's not a food court. It's basically like a startup economy for food. And these guys are operating out of 15, 20 square metres, and they're on a short-term license. So to make that shift from a food truck into a tendency like that to test something is much easier. We don't have the same established food truck market in Australia. So to find those types of operators to come in and try a new concept is really tough. So as a result of Spice Alley, he wanted a street food experience, but he basically had to bankroll the tenants. He couldn't operate, he couldn't find operators to do it. So whatever that's. Yeah.
Just a question from someone online.
Yeah.
They're just asking how to deal with retail that isn't a big stage development, how to understand the robust retail that responds to short term.
Really, really challenging, and I think that's the importance of making sure, understanding where the population at, where it's growing. This is something we had to do with the village, is the population wasn't there to begin with. So to get the guys in there, we were going to have to subsidise every for like 5 years. And then if there's a advantage to get those guys in there, you need to subsidise the rent. Then you also need to figure out how you stage the project and when you bring that retail space online. Then the importance of flexibility. So initially you might say, well, we're going to have this commercial space, so it's a commercial office in there, but you put in the services, put in the appropriate forces, lights, finishes, etc., so we can evolve into retail later. But it's a really big challenge that we're finding, particularly in some of these suburban growth areas, where the population's growing really quickly, but it's going to take 10 years to reach the full potential. And if you want to get in early to get the first mover advantage over some of the other guys, how do you manage that? Normally we have what's called a stabilisation period, which would be 1 year to 2 years to bed down your tenants. In some of these suburban growth areas, you need to have a stabilisation period of 5 years or so.
Yeah, I suppose we can go to that. I was just going to say, we're talking about lots of developments similar, there's no community there to be. So I suppose it kind of links into some tools. Is that
The other thing I was talking before about psychographics, so there's Helix personas and there's mosaic customer groups. And you can start to look at what are some of the other suburban growth areas in Australia. They're all pretty similar. There are a lot of first generation Australians or immigrant Australians, and they're wanting that lifestyle that they see in Australia, want the backyard, all of that sort of lifestyle. And you can start to see how educated they are. And there's some common themes about who those different customer groups are. And then you start to get an understanding of their lifestyles. So even if it's a greenfield site, you can start to plan for some of that. But then you also think, well, what's going to separate us and make us different and maybe a little more aspirational compared to the typical shopping centre?
In typologies,
Yeah.
Actually have the let's name it top
Yeah.
Yeah, how do you actually, this placemaking is kind of like a challenge.
Yeah.
Especially in a difficult scenario. How do you actually ensure that retail actually succeeds?
I've got a full brief on that. I could have gone through that, and there's a whole bunch of different criteria in DNA, and that's where the importance of tenancy sizes. But I'm really big on successful precincts have a lot of diversity and a lot of fine-grained detail. So rather than a whole bunch of glass and a whole bunch of homogenous looking retail tenancies, how do you work with the tenants? So do they put pot plants out the front of their store? How do they put little park benches out the front? understanding then what the landscape is, the appropriate trees, the right path widths. We're on a project in Melbourne at the moment, and the developer's putting 2.5 metre wide footpath. If you want to get food and beverage on there, you need a minimum of 4, really 4.5. But you don't want to be so wide that if you don't have food and beverage on there, it feels way too spacious, and then you go, well, how do we fill this and make this feel alive? But I think it comes down to making sure you've got the right tenancy sizes, and you've really got to hold a vision for what that is and go and find the right tenants. And don't try to maximise your rent. Try and find the right tenant, and over time you'll be able to drive the income.
Sam, with understanding your target customer and the demographic in the area and how you tailor the retail to the user, you can get an economic and social research report done, and that's really important. But how do you best really understand, like for the developer and the designers, how do you best understand what would
social research will give you a lot. What I like to do is if you can afford it, it's $35,000 or so doing focus groups with who your target audience is, who your target customers are. Ask them about their lifestyle, ask them about their favourite high streets to go to, their favourite places to go on holiday, their favourite places to take family on a Thursday night out on a weekend, and ask them where are your favourite places to go out, who are some of the great restaurants or cafes you like to go to, and then you start to get a sense of the times and places that they go to, and that helps inform what your target retail is going to be.
So perhaps just leading on from that question, an example of North Sydney. So what kind of questions did you ask, and what's the outcome?
It was really interesting because a lot of them, it was predominantly workers, because most of the residents there are older. But things that I was asking them, what do you think is missing from North Sydney? And it kept on coming back, instant experiences, cool wine bars, basement bars, rooftop bars, all that type of thing was really common. Where you ask them about food operators, they said we want the type of operator going to get in Darwin, Surrey Hills. So basically, what they're after a true inner city urban experience, which doesn't exist really on the North Shore. You may say Crow's Nest exists to some degree, but not really. One of the big gaps, and I knew this from talking to Palace Cinemas on a couple of other projects, is there was no cultural or nighttime anchor to drive people into North Sydney. So we were trying to plan for a cinema, but where the project was at the moment, we didn't have any more further discussion done saying we're planning for one. No, that was going to be a great anchor to drive visitation in there on a weekend. But it really came down to they want great control in the city, youthful urban experiences, which just doesn't exist in the city. And they don't have a lot of buildings to deliver that. And I think if you look at the new buildings that have been delivered over there, a lot of it's just really poor ground plane architecture. It's not delivering that fine grained experience that is going to resonate with the youth that want to go there. And then as a result, attract the businesses that go, well, it's going to be much easier to sell to attract staff in North Sydney. We've got a great nighttime economy, a great ground plane experience.
Why do you have to be so slow? Like it's just
Council.
dead. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Dead on the weekend.
In the 1990s up until the early 2000s, you had a lot of bars over there. It was like at the time it was called the King's Cross in the North Shore. You had probably 8, 9, 10 bars that were open on the weekend. So you had lots of people go to North Sydney on a Saturday night. But I think what ended up happening, the owners of the bars, the owners of the landlords started shutting them down. I think the aspirations of where younger people were, a lot of them started travelling a lot more. They'd gone to Hong Kong, London, New York, whatever. They wanted those experiences when they came back home. So they weren't getting that in North Sydney. So they started going to Surrey Hills, to the Cross, Darwin, whatever it might be. It spoke to a lot of the Richard Florida, who was, I guess, a social commentator who wrote a book called The Rise of the Creative Class. And that was where you really started to see this shift. Talking in the 90s, where the rise of independent music or alternative music became mainstream. Sort of things like the arts. I guess you even look at the past 10 years how the arts became mainstream. So people they had this identity that they wanted to be seen cool, they wanted to go to cool, fine grained wine bars, or bars, pubs, clubs. And as a result, they ended up going to There just wasn't a beverage offer. There was a beverage offer, but it wasn't a great dining scene.
It seems like it's still lacking, even though like frozen systems so well, and there's so much. Even in the project that you're proposing, is it still struggling with that?
Oh, look, there's a whole bunch of issues here. So, I can't go into too much detail on that. But the other big thing in North Sydney is the lack of a residential population that's in the city that then could spill out and get into activated bars, because the residents that live surrounding us, like my parents live in Nance Point, you've got all these awesome villages like Bruce Point Road, Kirribilli, Wilson's Point, Neutral Bay, so Crow's Nest. So they're far more attractive for people to go to come into North Sydney, particularly when they've done these ground planes. They've got some good operators in there, like the grounds and stuff. But you're just going into a soft place, like it just doesn't work for me, father of three kids.
The solvers bit, that's like
I don't. You're a really important part of it, but getting the right retail mix, the tenancies, having design guidelines that those tenants need to dress up their shop fronts. They need to be encouraged to put pop plants out the front. There's a whole bunch of those smaller, finer grained details that need to be done. Walker Street, I think, it's got the potential to be a great street. The London plane trees through there are great. So it's great shade in summer, great solar access in winter. That attracts people. It softens down all that build form. But the retail at the ground level is just diabolical because landlords don't get what they need to do. Go on with some real estate investment trust or REIT, some asset manager just doesn't really care. He gets enough income that comes off it, and he probably sees it. It's only generating 1%, 2% of income in his total asset. And he hasn't thought about, well, if I get some really good retail here, maybe I can increase my rents upstairs by an extra $10, $20 a square metre, and that starts to add significant value. Some of those guys, some of the office landlords are starting to think like that. It's been a long journey.
Now, in that particular instance, would you consider the fact that Pacific Highway is 6-lane road in the particular, it ends in a area?
Yeah.
That's negative.
Oh, absolutely. It's 6-lane highways. There's no human scale to it, no human element to it. Slow moving traffic where you may say it's a quasi shared street. In some ways, Crown Street, Surrey Hills works a little bit like a shared street. The traffic moves slowly, you can just walk across it. 6-lane highways without parked cars next to it is a major issue. Unless it's destinational retail or showroom retail. So when you go to the Crow's Nest, you've got all those furniture stores. They need to rely on passing traffic. But they don't need that lovely human experience.
But then frozen.
Exactly. You go down Willoughby Road, and there's certain elements on Willoughby Road I think they could improve by building up all those concrete sort of boxes. It blocks out. It takes away from the sense of user walking or driving down that street. But roads is a major issue, and it comes down to that whole human experience. And as a result, retail in particular places doesn't work. In other places it does because you've got so many things. It's like buses. They're not great when they've got a bus stop outside the cafe. All right. That's a pleasure. But if you ever got questions or a bit of run, just feel free to reach out. Dan's got my details, or you can come down on Instagram or whatever you do. It's Bellringer.
Oh, Bellringer.
Bellringer PG. Oh, thank you very much.